We had the minutes of the regular meeting of October 11th, 2022 in our read-ahead. And if there's no corrections, additions, or deletions, looking for a motion to approve.
I motion to approve the minutes for the regular meeting of October 11th, 2022 as submitted.
Second.
Okay, motion and a second to approve the minutes. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, minutes are approved. We'll now open up this meeting to the public. If anyone out in the audience would like to present something to the board, now's your time. Okay. We will move on to new business, which we have none of, and then we'll go to old business. First section of old business is the proposed ordinance amending Article 169 of the Utility Board. So I guess it's my responsibility to give an update. The update is, on October 17th, 2022, the MUB Board and staff met in person with City Council and their staff. Ordinance 169 was the major topic. The MUB Board and the MUB staff spent numerous hours in preparation of this meeting, fully trusting that communication was the number one priority. This was a 3-hour-plus conversation. MUB reviewed their existing communication plan and developed a new and more comprehensive plan. At this meeting, MUB presented the plan to City Council, fully anticipating this new plan would be a great starting point on improved communication, and as with most plans, would be a template for building trust. Both entities were satisfied to let this communication plan evolve as it was applied over the next several months. We had a follow-up meeting on October 24th, 2022, with a six-member subcommittee met. The topic of this meeting was the definition of ordinary course of business. Again, the MUB Board and the MUB staff spent hours reviewing the ordinance and preparing a response to these definitions. MUB presented these definitions to City Council. A constructive and open meeting developed a new and mutually agreed upon set of definitions. Then on November 9th, 2022, the MUB Board and staff met in person with City Council and staff. Again, the ordinance was the topic, and a review of the subcommittee definition of ordinary course of business was presented to both parties. Both parties engaged in open and candid discussion. The meeting abruptly ended with no further discussions or meeting date being scheduled. So that is my update on the ordinance. Michael, we can discuss the mutual bond reserves.
Yes, the municipal bond reserves, the city has asked that we provide a letter or memorandum detailing what dollars will be coming back from what bond issues and a plan to spend those dollars. And in talking with our engineering division, they have identified some projects that are directly related to the city paving program that we have asked them to delay until we could make some improvements. And after discussing that, we realized that is a very prudent use of those funds. So we have modified the plan. A summary of that plan is in your read-ahead, talking about the water bonds and the dollars that would come back from it, and as well as the sewer bonds. If you like, I could go through those, or each one of those, it hasn't changed substantially from previously except for the city paving projects.
I think you should read through it.
Okay. So we anticipate, and these are approximate numbers at the time that they will return, but $678,301 from water bonds. $40,000 of that would be used for the Brown Street water line replacement project, which is directly related to city paving. $75,000 for the Grandview Avenue waterline replacement, and that'll be $75,000. The Junction Street waterline replacement, that's estimated at $25,000. The compact track loader, estimated at $80,000. Half of that would be paid for with the water revenue and half with the sewer. And the Deckers Creek Boulevard waterline replacement project is approximately used about $500,000. The estimated total cost of that project is $600,000, but we believe we'll have the funds to do the complete project. On the sewer bonds, we estimate approximately $1,335,000 coming back. Again, the compact track loader, 50% or $40,000. A new vacuum truck, which, by the way, we did have Golden Equipment in today to demo one, to show one to us, estimated at $600,000. And the University Motors White Park sewer line replacement project, we would use $695,000 of those dollars for the first phase, which would be in White Park. And just as a side note to that, Rich and I met with Bo Park yesterday, and Rich gave a presentation about the first phase in White Park. And so I think it was received well, and we shouldn't have any issues getting a encroachment agreement.
And that's not the first time we met with Bo Park to discuss that. We did a walkabout with them.
We've actually had two walkthroughs, one with the city engineering department and then with Bo Park, and Barbara was able to attend the second one. So if you have any questions, Rich and I will be glad to address those.
Mike, we've talked a few times about the new vacuum truck, the replacing one that was purchased a year after the end of the Reagan administration, or actually the year of the end of the Reagan administration. How old are the other two that we have in the system?
I think one is, the newest one, I believe, is about, I want to say 15 years old, approximately.
I think they're all older than 15.
They're older than 15.
Okay.
Eric.
Yeah, so I think that's, are we anticipating in the next 3 to 5 years probably updating again? Or is that something we need to start, basically, should we start planning budgetarily to make sure that we don't have another one approaching its 35th birthday?
Well, let me start by saying I sure hope so.
Yeah.
Yes, we will be planning for the next ones. This just with these municipal bond reserves gives us an opportunity to get the 1989 model one replaced. So I think it's a good use of funds, and I say each of these projects, each of these purchases would be in what we defined as the ordinary course of business for the Morgantown Utility Board.
And so one of the reasons I ask, and where I was as a municipal employee in Indiana previously, we had some kind of mad scientists in our street department that converted an old vac truck and kind of a box truck type of vehicle to do leaf pickup for the waste on the stormwater side. So just wondering in the future if we don't have something like that, probably not a candidate for the one that was from '89, but in the future there may be opportunities to recondition an old vac truck to help the guys on the stormwater side.
Maybe.
Other questions on the use of the funds? Okay, Michael, let's go to Upper Popenoe.
Okay, the Upper Popenoe Sanitary and Stream Restoration Project. E.L. Robinson has updated the project cost estimate at $2,475,000. They have completed their field surveying, and the sanitary sewer design is almost complete, but it will be finalized once the stream design is completed based upon that survey information. So they are moving ahead. I also included with your packet a copy of that cost estimate.
Okay, Westridge?
Yeah, the Westridge Chaplin Hill development, as we discussed in the last board meeting about the 50% grant, 50% local share funding, which could be loan or a direct cash contribution. That revised project information has been submitted to the West Virginia Water Development Authority. The application we did put in for a $2 million loan, but that doesn't mean we have to take the loan. We just went ahead and put the loan dollars down as for the portion of the Westover Bridge water line replacement. We don't have hard numbers yet on the project cost. These are preliminary at this time, so I would recommend we don't make any decisions about how the local share or MUB's share of that is put together until we have a better idea of the cost. And also, this project will not go in front of the Water Development Authority Board, for the Economic Enhancement Grant until late November or early December. So we have plenty of time to make decisions, but our preliminary application is in, so hopefully we will be successful.
Okay.
The EPA Brownfields Grant ERP, we advertised for statements of qualifications from licensed remediation specialist services for the Dinsmore Tire property on August 4th and August 11th of 2022. We selected 3 firms. Following those interviews, conducted the week of October 3rd, 2022. Staff selected Greenbrier Environmental Group as the most qualified firm to assist with LRS services and began scope and fee negotiations. The initial scope of work will include abatement and demolition planning, voluntary remediation program application preparation, and development of a VRP site assessment work plan for an estimated cost of $40,000. Once the site assessment work plan is discussed with and approved by the West Virginia DEP, an additional proposal will be provided by Greenbrier to finish the VRP process that includes the site assessment, sampling and analysis, data validation, risk assessment, development of a remedial work action plan, and a final report. We are recommending to the board that they approve the contract with Greenbrier Environmental Group.
I move that MUB approves a contract to Greenbrier Environmental Group Incorporated for licensed remediation specialist services with respect to Phase 1 of the cleanup of the former Dinsmore Tire property in an amount not to exceed $40,000, and to authorize the general manager to sign all documents related to said contract.
I second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to award a contract to Greenbrier Environmental Group for the remediation services at Dinsmore. Do we have questions on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, motion passes unanimously. You going to do the flood control study now, Mike?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, this evening we have Mr. John Lyons with Strand Associates and Mr. Chris Rust with Strand Associates, and also Tim Rice with Potesta here to put on, to discuss with us this evening the Phase 1 flood control study that the board instructed staff to move forward with after the 2 flood events last summer.
Okay. I didn't know if it...
Shall we go down?
I didn't
How do
know.
we want to do this?
Yeah, I didn't know if we should have gone here first, but no?
I don't think
No.
so.
Okay. All right, so we can head on down to the audience.
I got to present in this direction. Up here? Up here, okay.
Mike thought we were more comfortable down there.
Find a seat.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm John Lyons with Strand Associates, and I'll be kicking off the presentation tonight, and I'll turn it over to Chris Rust in a minute. And we've got probably 40 or so slides. We hope to move through them in approximately 30 minutes, and then certainly open it up for any questions that anybody has at that point. So our agenda for this evening really is a discussion of the recent flood events that occurred in Morgantown. We're going to go over a review of the findings from phase 1 of the flood study, and then we'll wrap up with what we think are the next steps in the study. So I'm sure most of you are aware that there were 2 significant events, June 13th and July 29th of 2021. These were both very extreme events. Here's some pictures of Morgantown during that event. This picture on the left is of Patterson Drive, and you can see that there was extensive flooding there. It was actually flowing water, similar to what you would expect to see in a river, et cetera. And I think we'll provide a little insight into why that happened in a few minutes, but obviously there was extensive flooding across the community. So what we thought we would do is arrange our discussion tonight around 4 major steps. First is understanding the rainfall that fell in those 2 events, determine where the flooding occurred, understand the existing stormwater management system that is in place today, and then we wanted to review some of our initial observations of the flooding that occurred. So understanding the rainfall that caused the flooding. This is a map of Morgantown. It's a little bit difficult to see, but these green dots that are up there represent rain gauges that record data that is publicly available. So when you look at rainfall events and flood events, and if you look at one rain gauge, it can be very misleading. You really want to look at a variety of gauges spread across an area, because what you typically see is there's wide variability regarding the rainfall that fell with any particular event. So there are actually 6 gauges that we looked at. And then what we do is we characterize the various rainfalls. So on the June 13th event, the rainfall varied from 0.77 inches to 3.3 inches over an hour. And 3.3 inches of rainfall in 1 hour is very intense rain. So the average for that June 13th event was about 1.9 inches. And we'll get into explaining what that means in a minute. On to the July 29th event, the gauges ranged from 2.88 to 6.42. 6.42 is extremely intense, extremely unusual. So the average for that second event was 3.9 inches in 1 hour. So what does that mean? And this is sometimes a difficult and challenging concept to convey to people, because as engineers we always use the term 100-year, 50-year, and in this particular case we would be telling you you had 2 100-year events within about a month of each other, which doesn't make sense, right? So in reality what that means, we characterize rainfall events, we look at 50 years of historical data, as much data as we can find, and we just run statistics on it. And it's really an issue of probability. So the rainfall events that we characterize, when we say a 100-year event, we mean that there's a 1% probability in any given year that that storm can occur. A 50-year event means there's a 2% probability. The way I like to think about it is sort of like the roulette wheel, right? What's the probability of hitting a green, right? And I think it's about 12%. Doesn't mean you can't get 2 greens in a row, just means in any given event, there's an X% probability of occurring. Well, with rainfall, this is what we see. We look at all the historical rain that Morgantown has received, and we basically have determined that about a 3-inch rainfall event, that's shown in that yellow bar on the graph. That's anything above that is greater than a 100-year event and has less than a 1% probability of occurring. Both of these events that we have been looking at exceeded that 100-year probability. So we are over in the right side of this spectrum with those two events. And you can see the red text below it. Now, the other important element of this graphic is you can see this blue horizontal line is between the 10-year and the 25-year event. And that's in essence what the engineering standard for a level of service for storm sewer conveyance systems is typically about a 10-year to a 25-year storm. Okay, so starting fresh in a community, you're going to put storm sewer systems in to convey runoff. A typical design standard in the United States is somewhere between a 10 and 25-year event. And again, it's kind of community specific, but that's in general terms. So even with a well-designed storm sewer system that meets industry standards, when you get rain events like you experienced on those 2 dates, those systems are going to be overwhelmed. So, June 13th event, 2 of the 6 rain gauges were in excess of the 100-year event. And this is another interesting thing when you look at the data, and again, I'm hoping you all can see those values. My old eyes are having a little bit of trouble, but for each of these gauges, we put the total magnitude of rainfall that fell. And what you can see is there is a wide variation, particularly from the northern portion of the city down to the southern. Same with this event. 5 of the 6 rain gauges recorded rainfall in excess of the 100-year event. So, and now we're going to get into determining where the flooding occurred. Again, there tends to be a relationship, no surprise, right, with where the real intense rainfalls fell and where the complaints came to that MUD received on those 2 events. So the red dots show you the complaints that were received. So this is the June event. You can see that there's a cluster of complaints up in the top left portion of the map. And again, that's where the rain gauges were recording the most rainfall. The complaints were a little bit more widespread on the July event, but that really shouldn't be a surprise because the gauges showed higher intensity rainfalls in a number of gauges across the community. But again, in both of these events, we do see some gauges that even around the city, outside the city limits, that did show significant variability in the total rainfall that fell. So, the combined complaints, there were 239 documented flooding locations in both those events, 239. And you can see that a lot of them were clustered up in the northwestern portion. So, the first question everyone asks is, why did this happen? What's the probability of it happening, et cetera? So I thought it would just be helpful. Chris and I do a lot of this as part of our jobs. We live and breathe stormwater. It excites us, probably bores you people, but one of the things that we have seen over the last decade is more widespread occurrences of flooding, more intense rainfalls. And so here's just some examples from some of our clients, Paducah, Kentucky, Winnetka, Illinois, Erlanger, Kentucky, it's where I live, and Hebron, Kentucky. And again, in all of these cases, we were finding situations where these intense cells centered on a particular area of a community overwhelmed the storm source system and widespread flooding occurred. That situation in Paducah up on the top left, that's actually around their hospital. So access to the hospital was not available during a couple of these events, which obviously is a dangerous situation. Eastern Kentucky, I mean, I think everybody's probably aware of the events that occurred this past year in Eastern Kentucky. And again, I think sometimes it's helpful to put magnitudes in perspective. And you can see from this graphic that some areas got upwards of 14 to 16 inches of rainfall, which is difficult to really get your arms around in terms of that much rain falling on one area in a short period of time. And then this image on the right shows you some of the radar that shows you some of the peak intensities, and also, quite frankly, sort of how limited it is. These cells seem to come into an area and kind of stall and sit and just dump rain, and bad things happen from there. So that's just a little bit of perspective from around the Midwest from some of our other clients that are experiencing similar situations with flooding. So as we step back and we look at where these complaints occurred, and we look at the type of rainfall that caused these issues, we begin to start trying to figure out, okay, why did this happen? And one interesting thing that we found in Morgantown is these blue polygons. Let me see if I can. I'll use this one. Can you see where my red pointer is? This blue area and this blue area are actually designated FEMA floodplains. So that means FEMA has done a modeling exercise, a study, and they've determined that in a 100-year storm, those areas will be inundated with water. So I'm going to turn so I can point. So all these yellow dots represent complaints from those storms from property owners along those floodplains. 43 structures. Just those structures alone, those 43 structures represent approximately $8.5 million in property value in the floodplain. So then we'll zero in a little closer. This is Burroughs Run. This is Popenoe Run. And then this is Popenoe Run upstream from the stadium. There's a culvert under there. But again, it's important for everyone to recognize that, as stormwater engineers, when we look at floodplains and we look at a 100-year storm, we in essence expect to see those areas flood. So this is going to be one of the challenges moving forward when we begin to look at alternatives for your community, is what do we want to do in these certified floodplain areas? Now, the good news is it may open up some opportunities to bring some federal funding in, but depends on what the solutions that are allowable under it. Oftentimes, FEMA likes to do property purchases. They buy out the properties and remove them from the floodplain to stop recurring structure flooding. So these are some of the tools and some of the opportunities that are out there. But again, every community that is dealing with floodplain issues has to figure out, the direction that they want to go. So one of the exercises that I did in looking at these particular areas was, if you want to eliminate the water coming to the surface in a floodplain, you've got a couple of options. One is you provide extensive detention above it, so you stop the rain and the runoff from getting to those areas, which is pretty challenging to do depending on topography, et cetera. The other is you convey it. Because in essence, you saw on Patterson Drive, the water was running down Patterson Drive. That's moving through the floodplain. So the other way to deal with it is you convey it. You convey it underground. And the way you would do that in some of these areas is with extremely large box conduit systems. Picture a big rectangular concrete box buried underground that's big enough to convey these rainfall amounts. So we just completed one of these up in Cincinnati, and so I used the costing values of that. We didn't size this, we just did some real high-level numbers, but I just wanted everyone to sort of understand, when you're looking at trying to solve some of the problems that you have here, like what kind of dollars are we talking about? So this is really just to help everyone understand the magnitude of potential solutions. This is very high level, it's very preliminary, but I used $3,000 a linear foot, because that's what basically the box in Cincinnati cost that I think is big enough to convey these events. So when you look at these values, you see in Burroughs Run, we would probably need about 6,000 linear feet. Popenoe would probably need about 4,000 linear feet. Those two segments of box conduit, and I am not recommending them. I'm not telling you that it's the right solution. It's all about financial perspective. Those two systems alone, to get that floodplain underground and providing a conveyance system capable of conveying it, is probably $30 million. So again, in phase 2 of this study, that's one of the alternatives that could be explored. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Community input would be required to, provide input on those types of solutions, but it's just to help everyone understand the magnitude of what we're dealing with. So step 3 is understanding the system, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris to provide a little more detail on the next sections.
Thank you, John. So now that we've looked at the flooding events and where the flooding occurred, it is important to understand what is the existing stormwater conveyance system in Morgantown. And we have a definition on the slide here officially from EPA on what is the stormwater management system. So it's a conveyance or system of conveyances including roads with drainage systems, municipal streets, catch basins, curbs, gutters, ditches, man-made channels, or storm drains. So any type of catch basin, curb inlet, culvert pipe, storm drain, outfall, even the roadways themselves, once you get beyond that 10-year, 25-year event that John was describing earlier, sometimes the roadway itself can be used for stormwater conveyance to get the drainage down to the streams. So we have kind of shown some images here. There are circumstances, and as part of our initial observations in the city, some of the limitations of the conveyance systems, there are circumstances where when the road pavement gets kind of paved over multiple times, and you've got an existing inlet, such as the picture on the bottom right there, you lose a little bit of capacity of the inlets themselves to be able to capture that drainage, get it into the stormwater conveyance pipe network, and then out to the stream. So there are some limitations that we're going to discuss as part of this project in regards to the existing stormwater conveyance system. So this is a very broad, zoomed-out map, but as part of our flood control study, we have been provided the stormwater mapping from MUB, all of the stormwater conveyance systems, the pipes, the culverts, the catch basins, the manholes, all of that information that we have to evaluate to really understand in these locations where the flooding occurred. What does the stormwater conveyance system look like? How big is the stormwater conveyance? Like, what's the pipe size or diameter? What's the material? What's the elevations of that system to be able to drain some of the areas of the city? So pretty broad view here, but we do have some statistics as we're kind of evaluating the existing system here. Within the MUB stormwater service area, there's over 13,000 individual storm sewer segments that are conveying stormwater runoff during these rainfall events. That equates to about 150 miles of storm sewers and culverts within the MUB service area. So we are talking about a pretty significant amount of stormwater system throughout the service area that's conveying the runoff. And then over 20 miles of open channels and ditches, and approximately 6,000 individual storm structures, and that's any sort of catch basin, manhole, outfall, anything part of the stormwater conveyance system. All told, the stormwater boundary that MUB is responsible for from a stormwater management standpoint is about 9,000 acres. So we're talking about a very broad area and a significant amount of stormwater conveyance systems to help convey stormwater runoff. So one of the things we have started mapping as part of this, or reviewing in the mapping, are existing stormwater detention basins and green infrastructure. So these are the types of stormwater control facilities that would be helpful to manage the stormwater runoff during the rainfall event. A lot of these systems are kind of around the university. They have implemented some pretty good programs for green infrastructure, which is kind of a stormwater buzzword, but features that capture stormwater runoff, try to infiltrate as much of that as possible into the ground, and then slowly release it back into the stormwater conveyance system. So there are a variety of these kind of within the Popenoe Run and Burroughs Run watersheds. Unfortunately, some of these systems themselves became overwhelmed during those two events last summer. So they're good in practice, but they're designed to be able to detain a certain amount of drainage. Oftentimes that may be a 50-year event or a 100-year event. And when we have these events that are beyond that, those systems themselves can become overwhelmed. Case in point, the big orange area, kind of right in the middle of the map, is the big detention basin at the Alumni Center on the university property. And there was documentation that even that big detention facility became overwhelmed during those events last summer, where the water kind of overtopped or reached capacity of that basin, and a lot of that drainage is kind of what came down Pattison Drive during those events. So one of the challenges as part of the flood control study and looking at these issues is really understanding the ownership of the stormwater conveyance system. We have received mapping from MUB. We've received stormwater mapping from West Virginia University. We have some understanding of the infrastructure that's also owned by Department of Highways. And what we wanted to highlight here is just an example of some of the complex issues when it comes to stormwater conveyance, when there's multiple agencies or multiple owners of the stormwater conveyance system. Kind of hard to tell with the coloring here, but the blue lines on this map are MUB stormwater management system, stormwater pipes. Yellow lines on the map are West Virginia University-owned stormwater conveyance systems. And then kind of that big red line right through the middle of the page there is the big culvert underneath Pattison Drive that we believe is owned by Department of Highways. So the point being here, there is a lot of collaboration that needs to happen with MUB, the university, Department of Highways, all of these various agencies that own pieces of the stormwater conveyance system within some of these drainage areas and watersheds that were impacted by the rainfall events. Kind of further highlight the need for that collaboration, we created this map here based on parcel data or property information. Everything highlighted yellow on this map are properties or parcels that are owned by West Virginia University. So quickly realizing that, they're the single largest property owner within Burroughs Run and Popenoe Run, where they're certainly an important partner in this effort to help manage some of the stormwater runoff from some of the impervious surfaces associated with portions of the campus. So step 4 in the process is to document some of our initial observations of the flooding clusters. So one of the things we've attempted to do, at least in this first phase of the flood control study, is identify where were the clusters of flooding that were documented by the public or by MUB during these events in the summer of last year. So we've kind of put some boundaries around some of these clusters of flooding areas. We've got 11 specific locations highlighted on the map. We don't have enough time tonight to kind of touch upon every single one of those, but these are the 11 clusters that we are drilling down into as part of this flood control study to really understand where the flooding occurred, what are the limitations of the conveyance system, and what are some options or alternatives to try to help mitigate the flooding that occurred. So we're going to highlight a few of these as part of this, but the process that we go through when we've identified these clusters in the first phase of the flood control study, kind of a step-by-step process, reviewing MUB's records of the flooding or drainage issues documented by the public. One of the first things we do is delineate drainage areas to the locations of flooding, how much runoff is coming from the upstream drainage area or watershed to those locations. We also conducted site visits with our project partner, Potesta, to kind of go out, take some initial observations on what does the existing infrastructure look like, and then a preliminary review of the conveyance capacity of the stormwater infrastructure itself. So the drainage areas corresponding to these 11 clusters are what we've highlighted on this map. So it's pretty broad, but the clusters themselves are generally focused for now within the Burroughs Run and Popenoe Run watersheds, where a significant amount of the flooding was documented during those events. So for each one of those clustered areas, we've used topographic information and the storm sewer mapping data to identify how big is the drainage area or watershed coming to each individual cluster of issues. So one of the ones we wanted to highlight, what we're calling flooding cluster 1, is the location at Stewart and Idlewood. This is kind of in the upstream portions of the Popenoe Run watershed. During that event, and again, from a scale standpoint, it may be a little bit difficult to see, but we've got these red dots and red squares on the map that kind of designate specific addresses or locations where MUB had documentation of flooding occurring during these particular events. So about 5 properties that were impacted in this location. Unfortunately, it looks pretty bad just in terms of the amount of drainage that caused flooding in this particular location. Images on the left are kind of looking along Stewart Street, and then images in the middle and the right are kind of immediately upstream of Stewart Street, where there was a lot of impact to vehicles and property, a little bit of property damage with parking lots because of the magnitude of the drainage coming from upstream. Another complicating issue on this one, there was an active construction site upstream from this area. You know, when you get a rainfall event beyond a 100-year event, even some of the measures that are taken on a construction site, like silt fence or sedimentation basins, can become overwhelmed, and that's why the flood waters in particular in this location look pretty murky or dark. It's because of a lot of the runoff coming from an active construction site. So just kind of taking a step back on the map here, this cluster here is Stewart Street, where this kind of cluster of 5 dots are on the map. The drainage area coming down to that spot on Stewart Street, based on the delineation that we've done, is about 94 acres. So everything kind of highlighted there in that blue boundary is land from a topographic standpoint that is flowing down towards Stewart Street, generating stormwater runoff during these rainfall events. So unfortunately, the existing infrastructure kind of in this area, immediately upstream of where the flooding occurred, is pretty small. So this kind of images are the existing stormwater conveyance system, the piping network in this particular location. For example, you've got a 24-inch diameter pipe trying to convey runoff from about 90 acres of drainage. And from an engineering standpoint, you know, we've got some general rules of thumb or things that we look at, and this is one of those situations where, you know, in order to convey runoff from 90 acres, you need something a lot larger than a 24-inch diameter pipe. It's just too small of a pipe to be able to convey that much runoff. Now, fortunately, MUB, you know, it was mentioned earlier in the board session here, the Popenoe Run project, stream restoration project, does include some improvements up to this zone to improve some of the conveyance capacity, but these are some of the limitations or issues that we've identified initially here that we know we're kind of seeing as a challenge moving forward. Flooding cluster 6, we've talked a little bit about this, Sean mentioned this, but Pattison Drive itself, this is a zoomed in map of Pattison Drive. The blue polygon on the map is the FEMA 100-year floodplain. When we kind of look at the extent or limits of the 100-year floodplain, it seems to correlate pretty well with what happened during those events in the summer of last year. Kind of on the upstream end of the map here, right here where I'm pointing is the Alumni Center Pond. You can see that's completely inundated by floodwaters in a 100-year event according to the FEMA floodplain map, which again seems to have happened during those events last year. Again, additional images there. The image on the left is the detention basin at the Alumni Center. You can see kind of how much water is ponded up in that. This is kind of looking at the upstream end, looking downstream towards Pattison Drive. I don't know that we necessarily have a good picture of it, but on the downstream end of that is where the water was overtopping the roadway and then impacting Pattison Drive itself. Some other observations or information that was provided to us, this picture on the bottom right is kind of looking inside the big box culvert underneath Pattison Drive, where there are some restrictions of flow within the culvert itself. When we're looking at kind of older infrastructure like this, sometimes you do notice some things where there was some old conduit, for example, running right through the middle of the box culvert. When you get a big rainfall event, you get debris and stuff kind of piled up inside the culvert itself. That that is something else that can restrict the flow through the culvert itself. So you're trying to get as much runoff into the culvert, but you want it to be as kind of free-flowing as possible. So there are things like this that we will identify in the flood control study as kind of corrective issues from a maintenance standpoint to try to improve the capacity of the existing system. One of the other challenges with this, so this map here is kind of a broad drainage area to Patterson Drive itself. So all these kind of color-coded areas are other portions of the watershed where there were flooding clusters identified. All told, there's about 600 to 700 acres of drainage coming through that box conduit along Patterson Drive. We're showing these flow direction arrows, again, from a watershed perspective. We are looking for improvement alternatives on the upstream end of the watershed, but we want to make sure if we improve a condition further up in the watershed to address a flooding issue, we don't push more flow downstream and further exacerbate or cause a new issue downstream. So that's where we get into kind of at the upstream end of the watershed, looking for detention basin opportunities or storage to hold back more of that flow, such that we don't just continue pushing drainage issues or flooding further downstream. Some other pictures. This is the open channel conveyance system, kind of right along Patterson Drive here, where that culvert daylights next to the roadway. You get kind of sedimentation buildup over time that can further restrict some of the flow in the open channel system. So some of this can be addressed with maintenance activities or regrading to kind of, reconvey more of that flow by reestablishing a better conveyance system of the open channel system itself. Or, the alternative that John had shown before, maybe there are opportunities here to enclose this with a bigger box conduit and kind of bury this such that you don't have this open channel system right next to the roadway itself. Flooding cluster area 7 that we did want to highlight too is the Suncrest neighborhood. For this particular neighborhood, there was over 25 properties, individual properties or addresses that had some type of issue, drainage issue or flooding issue during these two events from last year. So kind of a pretty significant clustering of houses along some of these residential areas. Just some pictures here of some backyard flooding and drainage issues that occurred during those events. And then again, from a drainage area perspective, we've kind of broken this one up into 3 different zones. We're saying all of this is part of the Suncrest neighborhood, which is just under 60 acres of drainage, but in reality, when we kind of drill down and look at the topography and the stormwater conveyance system, portions of this are flowing west along Fairlawns Avenue, about 38 acres. Portions of it are flowing north along Jacobs Drive, only about 8 acres. And then Cambridge Avenue, about 11 or 12 acres, which is also kind of flowing in its own separate direction. So even the Suncrest neighborhood itself that we're showing here with 60 acres, there's kind of like 3 mini clusters or mini drainage areas or watersheds just within the Suncrest neighborhood as well. And again, from an existing infrastructure standpoint, we are encountering these are pictures inside of existing manholes, just as an example, within the Suncrest neighborhood. Very, very old infrastructure, old brick manholes, almost not surprising to some degree based on where we've worked in other communities where we have very old systems, and you look at kind of the complexity of these old manholes, a lot of different piping systems within the manholes themselves. In this particular case, there are neighborhoods within the city that have both separate sanitary sewers and separate storm sewers, but then within the manholes themselves, within those structures, there are some hydraulic connections between the storm system and the sanitary system, where once you get a big enough rainfall, that's kind of all acting as one almost combined sewer system of conveying runoff during these events. So this is definitely a challenge. This is not like a situation here where you can just come in and easily replace a manhole. There are a lot of various connections and piping systems going into these storm sewers and sanitary sewers within these neighborhoods. So our initial conclusions within the flooding cluster areas, as I mentioned, there are potentially undersized stormwater conveyance infrastructure. Again, you've got large drainage areas or watersheds coming into the stormwater conveyance system that may be undersized to convey these larger design storms. Storm inlets with limited capacity. I did show that one picture there where some of the pavement overlays have impacted some of the existing inlets, so it will be important just to reestablish the inlet capacities themselves. There is a very complex system between the storm and sanitary sewers in some of these neighborhoods, where it's not necessarily just a storm sewer issue. It is a little bit of a combination of a storm sewer and sanitary that are kind of acting in tandem. Maintenance needs of the stormwater conveyance system, again, some of those partial blockages through box culverts or open channel systems that could use a little bit of maintenance to reestablish some conveyance capacity. And then really an overall lack of detention or stormwater storage upstream of the flooding clusters. There are a lot of developments that have happened over the years prior to there being stormwater regulations in place, where now we've got a lot of impervious surfaces, rooftops, streets, driveways that are just kind of free-flowing into the local stream network without being detained. And some of that's just a remnant of kind of older development prior to there being stormwater management regulations in place. Now that there are stormwater management regulations in place, any sort of new development or redevelopment project is required to put in detention basins to manage the stormwater runoff from new impervious surfaces. So there are activities that MUB has completed following the rainfall events from last year that we did want to highlight. MUB has completed some strategic maintenance improvements throughout Burroughs Run and Popenoe Run. MUB has completed the removal of some of the restrictions within the box culverts. That big box conduit underneath Pattison Drive, some of the conduit has recently been removed from within inside the box culvert itself to try to reestablish conveyance capacity. MUB has proceeded with planning and design of the stream restoration project along Popenoe Run, which was discussed earlier tonight. Collaboration with watershed partners has kind of been ongoing, but both with West Virginia University and Department of Highways, trying to bring these partners together is an important piece of this flood control study, given the complexities of the system, and you know, we're all kind of in this together with different pieces of ownership of the stormwater conveyance system. And then, of course, MUB has initiated the flood control study, and we're kind of wrapping up the first phase of the flood control study with these initial observations, and then hope to just quickly transition into the next phase of the study. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to John to kind of put some closing remarks on our presentation.
Thanks, Chris. So we're almost done. A couple more slides. So the phase one recap and next steps. The two storms evaluated were characterized as greater than 100-year events. We hit on that pretty hard. 238 total complaints were received for those two events. Many of the properties that flooded are located in the FEMA floodplain. That's a significant finding. Reported flooding was generally limited to the areas that received that real intense rainfall events. Again, this is preliminary, but when you look at those rain gauges, and you would see a gauge that only recorded 0.7 inches of rain, and there were some of those in those two events. Those neighborhoods didn't seem to experience any problems. It was when we get up to the 2.5, 3-inch events that the complaints seem to be centered around those particular locations. So the preliminary assessment of that is, okay, so for the smaller intensity rains, the system seemed to be conveying the flow reasonably well, at least enough not to generate a complaint. Needs further evaluation, but that's kind of a preliminary assessment. In a 100-year storm, okay, so that's generally performance by. The current storm source system is owned and operated by multiple public entities, right? It creates a challenge. Who owns what, who's responsible for what? Collaboration is going to be key to anything moving forward. And MUB has already completed a number of maintenance projects. Now, this is something I want to take a second to explain, because as we transition to the second phase of the study, you know, engineers will be looking at alternatives, and in terms of what size pipes do we want to put in, how much detention do we need, where do we need stormwater management practices, et cetera. And one of the key items that's going to need to be resolved at some point is what we call level of service. So this particular graphic shows you it's a rain event in the top, and you can see the blue shows you where the water from the runoff is. In the upper picture, it's right up against a home. It's come out of the storm sewer system in the street, it's flooded the street, and it's up against the home. That small circle below the tree is intended to represent the existing storm sewer system, presumably designed to convey about a 10-year event. So when you look at flood mitigation projects, you begin to ask yourself, well, what size storm do we want our infrastructure to convey? And that's called your level of service. So if, let's say for a 100-year event, we don't want any water up out of the street. We want it limited to the street and the stormwater conveyance system. Obviously, we're going to need a bigger pipe. And so the circle there below the tree in the second picture shows a bigger pipe necessary to convey the same amount of runoff as the top event. The challenge is what? Bigger pipe costs more money. So that becomes the challenge. And I'll use one quick analogy that I like to use. I think a stormwater conveyance system similar to roadways, our road network. So this Saturday, it's going to be a big football game in town. I imagine there's going to be pretty difficult traveling through downtown on your existing road network. So your level of service Saturday for your road network is going to be horrible. In transportation worlds, it's a level of service E or F. So now you say to yourself as a community, will we live with that 6 times a year? Or do we want to build a road network that can convey that Saturday football traffic? The answer is generally you live with that inconvenience because you don't want to pay for a network that is rarely going to be used. That's the same challenge we're going to have with the stormwater conveyance system. We're going to have to figure out that balance of cost and benefit. And that's what we'll be doing as we advance alternatives moving forward. So, next steps. Discussions are ongoing regarding implementation of the Phase 2 of the flood control study. One of the key items is going to be review and potentially revise the level of service. We need to collect and compile needed data of the existing storm sewer system. We've got a lot of it, but there are some data gaps. Identified projects to improve the stormwater management system. And we typically tackle this sort of in steps where you look for some low-hanging fruit. Are there systems that just need cleaning? Are there facilities that are underutilized that we can retrofit very cost-effectively? We want to get the existing system functioning as well as possible before we start investing in new infrastructure. And that's just sort of a good use of public dollars. One of the topics that will be explored is removal of properties in the floodplain. What does that do in terms of bringing the potential for federal dollars? There may be a local match, but it hopefully would not be all locally funded. So all those types of options will be explored moving forward. Evaluate large conveyance systems, and then how big is big enough. And then community input is going to be very important. Engineers can pretty much design anything, right? But every community is different. Every community has different priorities. Do you want to purchase properties in the floodplain and take them down or not? Do we want to go after federal funding or not? Do we want big, large regional detention facilities? Do we want large conveyance systems? That's got to come from the community. Estimated engineering cost for Phase 2 is about $300,000. And I'm going to wrap up the presentation with this final thought. When we talk about flood mitigation, it's really important to understand the distinction between flood mitigation and flood elimination. I always get concerned when I do these types of projects that everyone's expectations align with what we can really achieve. And we cannot eliminate flooding. There's always going to be a rain event that occurs that overwhelms whatever we design. So as we move forward, right, this becomes an exercise in flood mitigation and trying to provide an appropriate level of service to your community. And with that, we can open it up for questions. Yes, sir.
Going back to the very beginning, where you identified the rain gauges, do we have sufficient number of rain gauges, and are they in the right location?
Do you want to handle it? Oh, okay. I can repeat. Can I do this? Is that all right? The question was, do we currently have a sufficient number of rain gauges, and are they in the right locations? I think the short answer to that is we would benefit from having more publicly owned, maintained, and managed rain gauges. Some of the rain gauges that generate publicly available data are in people's backyards, and they just commit to sharing their data. So we really aren't 100% sure of the quality of those. So we've already had conversations with MUB about increasing the network and putting them in a more uniform distribution across the community, and then having sort of dedicated staff maintain those. Yes, sir.
Along those same lines, and it was tough for us to see on the slides, where those rainfall amounts were on those gauges. Were the heavier rains both times clustered in the same spots, or did we see variation in those highest concentrations of rainfall?
And I apologize, these look good when you're looking at it.
Oh yeah, they're great on the large format, absolutely.
Yeah, can you get me there, please? It was pretty varied is the short answer, and I will walk you through the amounts. I just gotta get closer so I can see them. So in this particular event, this gauge is reading 3.3. This is 1.98, 2.56, 1.2 inches, 0.77 inches, 1.69. So it was 2.5 here. These, the 1.6 is pretty big, but these two aren't too bad. And then up here we have 3.3 and just about 2 inches. So you would expect something in this area to show where your complaints were, Chris, and keep walking me through that if you would. Then in July, we had 3.49, 3.28, 2.88, 6.42 down here. Now that may be an outlier, and that gets to the issue of, it'd be good to have that as a publicly managed rain gauge, but we had 6.4 and 3.5 and 3.77 down here in that particular event.
Well, and that's, honestly, that makes me feel a little bit better at the fact that in that second rainfall event, this area, which did not, it bode worse, obviously, than the first rainfall event, but it was not the highest concentration, because even if that 6.42 is an outlier, you got the 3.77 and the 3.54 down there, and I believe the complaints were nearly what we had up in this area, because that was my other, down the road, I know we very much need to focus on these two areas that we've talked about up here. My concern is that's because the rain fell here last year. Where else could there be issues with concentrated rains?
That's right.
In the near future?
That's a great point, and again, that speaks to, level of service community-wide, because the rain, it'll never follow the same pattern in multiple events.
A follow-up on my first question and a little bit of his. If we were to install more MUB-oriented and maintained rain gauges, can you have at the same time telemetry that would tie into MUB central office in the event that we saw some abnormally heavy rainfall, that we could put alerts out through our various media that we have? Is that technology available?
It actually is. There's a couple of companies out there right now that actually, for large regional basins, they will connect to weather radar in real time, and they can adjust the operation of the gates in the basin based on the projected rainfall and the projected runoff. In this case, what we would be doing, quite honestly, probably would be just predicting the rainfall, looking at weather radar, would probably be no different than and probably a little bit behind what the news stations are doing, but you could certainly, if there were a network of people that wanted a text message or something that somehow could be linked to all of that. So the technology is there, it's just who do you notify, at what point do you notify them? The information would be basically connected to the radar that the weather stations are using. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so to kind of further John's point there, as some of the other communities that we've worked in do have, I would say in some circumstances, like 24 rain gauges across their service area. Some of those communities make that information available in kind of a public domain where anyone can get on the website and look at the rainfall data in real time. And they are sophisticated enough now where you can click and it'll tell you in real time, is this a 10-year event, a 25-year event, or a 100-year event, where anyone can quickly get on there and look at that data. And at the moment, we just do not have that, obviously, here in Morgantown, but it is something that we've shared with the staff at MUB and something that I think we would promote and suggest as part of the next phase of the flood control study. Yeah.
When I travel, I look a lot at situations in other countries as well as ours, and there's we're talking here a lot about hardcore kinds of development in terms of digging in the ground and putting in culverts and those kinds of things. But there are lots of other things that can be done, maybe on surface level, soft surfaces, permeable surfaces, cobblestones, and I think you mentioned before the edges of the roadway so that the roadway becomes a conveyance. And so I've seen a lot of that in other countries where they've really had a lot of mitigation of their rainwater runoff, stormwater, and I just think it would come down to some recommendations into that area, but also contractors and others and the kinds of surfaces that they install, the equipment that they use perhaps. I know I've often questioned why we can't use metal grids for parking as opposed to paving, and it's my understanding that the city does not permit that. So I think there are lots of things we could consider outside of this major construction effort that's going to take that would also help a lot.
Sure.
And I would hope that you probably recommend some of that.
Yeah, so I think some of the things that you're describing I would put in the category of what we would call more green infrastructure elements. I did show some of the kind of the green areas around the university where rain garden features have been installed. I'm not sure if the university has done any sort of permeable pavement anywhere on campus, but it's certainly part of kind of the toolbox, so to speak, of stormwater management practices of doing those types of, low impact development or green infrastructure to try to infiltrate more of the runoff. One of the challenges we see with that in a lot of these communities is just the native soils that we have don't really allow, clay soils that don't really allow for a significant amount of infiltration, but every little bit helps. So if there are more opportunities to do those types of permeable pavements or rain gardens and bioretention areas, that is certainly something that we would promote. It's just a matter of kind of, again, the level of service, how much benefit do we think we could get from some of those types of features?
Do you, in your report, do you foresee doing things along those lines with street tree programs? We had tested in another community that I lived in doing pine trees in place sometimes of more leafy trees because they tend to be better at sucking up stormwater, but also when you have snowplows come past, it's kind of an issue for the pine trees. Yeah. But is that some of the things that can be considered to help slow the conveyance of water?
Certainly, and I think one of the things, and again, we're going to have to drill down in the next phase into some of the city ordinances, for example, of like certain things that are or aren't allowed, and are there certain restrictions in those ordinances, for example, that may currently prevent that type of activity from happening, but may be a beneficial thing moving forward to help alleviate some of the drainage issues. So we have reviewed those types of ordinance in the past to look for some of those impediments for green infrastructure or better stormwater management, and I think that's something that we would encourage and recommend in the next phase.
Yeah, and I'll say it was something that one of my colleagues who was an arborist brought to my attention. It would have never been something that even came across my mind, much less my radar, but fortunately, employing people that have different levels of expertise is very valuable.
Let me just elaborate a little bit on this. First of all, we are huge advocates of green infrastructure. We do GI projects all around the Midwest. I think our firm is probably one of the leaders in the Midwest in GI. But I just want to temper expectations a little bit. If we're going to try to infiltrate in Morgantown, we're going to have under drains, unless we find under drains. So when you deal with clay soils, like the ideal situation is if you have areas, and I'll give you an example, downtown Cincinnati, the old Ohio River alignment used to go right through downtown Cincinnati. So even though generally it's high clay soils, there are areas in the old riverbed where you can infiltrate. So you can take literally a catch basin with no bottom, go down about 15 feet, and put every drop of runoff that comes to that and put it down into the groundwater, which is, now, you have to be concerned about the quality of what you're putting down there. But from a volume standpoint, when you can do dry wells and you can connect to the subsurface geology and infiltrate, you can get huge benefit from that from a flood reduction standpoint. But when we're dealing with, and again, we haven't done you can do a shallow soils exercise and look at shallow clays and say, oh, we can't infiltrate. You can look a little deeper and see if you have clean gravels that you can infiltrate. That exercise is phase 2. But if we can't infiltrate, a lot of these practices that we're talking about where you can put porous pavers on the surface, you will have to underdrain it. Now, you can get some storage in the gravel layer below it, but you begin to sort of lose a little bit of the cost benefit of it. And it's generally, if you can't infiltrate, those types of practices are good for probably up to like a 1-inch rain event. So you can help shave some of the peaks on these 3-inch rain events, but I will tell you, you can't eliminate them. Urban reforestation, we can do a canopy cover evaluation. There is a lot of impervious surface in Morgantown that is undetained. You will benefit from urban reforestation. But again, we have to go in with our eyes open a little bit. I would suggest that some of the other practices that you may want to explore would be things like parking regulations. So oftentimes you'll see a massive department store that the parking lot is sized for Thanksgiving or the day before Christmas or whatever. 90% of the time, that lot is generally empty. Is that something? A lot of people don't want to touch it. But just keep in mind, these solid surfaces, these pavement concrete surfaces, are driving flooding. Okay? The rain hits it and runs off. Now we got to deal with it. So the less impervious surface we have in your community, the easier this issue becomes. So there's a whole bunch of different tools we will look at and explore, and we're open to everything. But when we're dealing with 3, 4, 5-inch rain events, we just have to be realistic that what else can we do? We're going to need some big stuff to deal with that kind of runoff. So,
the upper part of Popenoe Run, you alluded to the fact that there was construction underway. That construction was underway outside the city limits, and that is one of the complications that Morgantown has. There are large portions of the watershed that are outside the city limit, and outside the city limit and in the county means there are no stormwater plans, there's no land use plans, there's no zoning requirements or anything like that. At some point, we probably need to have a conversation with the county because they do have some implications through their lack of action that impinge upon our ability as a public utility to manage stormwater here. So it's just an observation.
It's a great observation, and as Chris showed earlier, like in terms of runoff, like it doesn't care about political jurisdictions. It's all about topography, slope of land. Water runs downhill. So if you're in the upper end of a drainage area and you're just letting runoff run down, then the city would have to deal with it. So it's good if we can get everybody within the watersheds trying to proactively address the stormwater runoff. So I would concur that's an important aspect of it. And the other real important thing, Chris showed this in one of his graphics, but the general strategy in this type of situation is you want to hold water back in the upper portions of the watershed. So the rain hits, if you're down there, the receiving stream, you want to collect that runoff and get it to the stream and move it out of your system. If you're in the middle third of the watershed, you probably want to do a combination of detention and conveyance, because you're going to have the same volume of water to deal with. So what's the best way to manage it? Get the low stuff out, manage the middle stuff, and in that upper portion of the watershed, if you can hold that water back even 30 minutes to an hour, it buys you time to manage the peak flows that are coming down. So again, forget political boundaries. When you look at things as a watershed, that's kind of the overarching strategy that we would promote. And then we got to bring sort of the political side into that to try to make that effective.
All right. I'm apparently shorter. There's a lot going on here. Let's see. So, to be clear, I'm the mayor in Morgantown. My name is Jenny Celine, and I'm a person that happens to live on Pattison, so I guess that would be at the bottom of your strategy. I'm at the end of Popenoe Run.
Okay.
So I'm interested in, so now I understand that there is currently, also the city is going to help fund it, although you all haven't seen the funds yet, the upper part of Popenoe Run. A current strategy that's going on is quite a bit of channelization, and I don't know the entire plan, but I'm, as somebody who's down creek, interested in any kind of retention that can be part of that plan. So there's retention at the Alumni Center that you were showing, but this project is above that. And so I don't know where. I don't know if it could be by the WVU's football practice facility, talking about somebody else's jurisdiction. I don't know if that could be somewhere else on city property, but I am concerned about something being channelized to kind of help in some ways, but then in other ways accumulating more water quicker and then getting it downstream where there's, so below, downstream from this facility right now is Park, and so if we're bringing more water down fast and into the park, so I'm also interested in whenever we're dealing with one of these creeks or streams or streams that come up seasonally and are holding water, how we could, at the corners of a project like this project up above the stadium, having, and up above the Alumni Center, having water have some space at the corners to come out and settle a bit so that and these are through neighborhoods. So the idea of what do you do when you're dealing with, and this is your business, but it's also my business because I can see that if we further channelize up above, that we're going to end up with more problems below. As a person who's policymaker in the city, and my colleague Brian Butcher is here also, who is in this same neighborhood, just the other half of it. If there are ways that we can use some of the roadways, just tell people get off the roadways, to avoid flooding homes, businesses, without putting people's lives in danger, like on Pattison Drive when it comes up quickly, but where we don't have the pipe, or we don't have the pipe currently, where we can make sure, and we don't always have curbing. Sometimes we have ditches on the sides, which means then the roadway would have less capacity. This is me, non-engineer speaking. But whatever we could do to help with legislation about permeable surfaces, possibility of metal grids, possibility of special impervious pervious, not impervious, pervious pavement we want. And also there's some old-fashioned like brick configurations or concrete that
Let
has.
grass grow through.
And grass going, and then also where parking isn't necessary on a daily basis, having overflow parking that has that plastic matting underneath and then grows grass, so that you have grass, but then you can park on it. But that I understand you can't use daily very easily unless there's something new, because the grass won't grow. I think part of the problem around right here, and I think that also happens in the other southern part of town also, is that we're flat, we're on a plateau. We think, oh, we're way above the river, which we are, but we're on this plateau. And we have older structures with basements. I've lived places that had more houses built on a slab. So I don't know if that's something that people legislate. I'm sure nobody wants to hear that they can't have a basement, but when people are building basements, my personal house at another city more than 30 years ago was on a slab, and it worked out great because we didn't have flooding. Or the flooding would go around us and it wouldn't destroy the furnace.
Filled up your neighbor's basement because...
Yeah, but if, it was a whole neighborhood all on slabs, so. So if the city can help with storm drop capacity, and then the more that we can make available to people, easy to find data on all of this, easy to find data on where we have cleaned out the stormwater system, so people are encouraged, because we're wanting people to do what they can do on their home surfaces, and we can help with that. We could even provide mini grants or, some incentive where a homeowner would put in some money, and maybe we would give some sort of incentive to use permeable pavement. We are all on clay, and we have a tree board that loves plant trees, so if we can work on that more. And I did not know about under drains, but it makes sense because we do not percolate well around here. And also looking at we do have zoning and we do have a lot of parking lots, and making sure that we don't overbuild is just better for everyone. And coordinating with county, and we are inside and outside the city limits. As you see, there's all these holes. So my understanding is MUB plans by watershed, yes? Not just by like in the city, out of the city. But anyway, the more that we can collaborate with the county and the university and the DOH and plan by watershed, that's great. And I like what you're talking about detention and conveyance, because we definitely need both, because we need to just get that water out of there. Do you have people put, people say that there needs to be retention with individual property owners with new construction. Do people also ask for businesses and homeowners to retrofit, or give incentives to do retention on their own property? That's a good, you don't have to, you're just taking comment, but I will sit down and I would just love to hear what you think of.
Okay, I'll try. You covered a lot, so do you want any reaction to that, or do you want? Okay. So I'll give quick reaction, and Chris, you're gonna have to help me with some of this because I'm not sure I got it out. First, channelization, concerned about moving the problem downstream. That's what Chris talked about. That's a very legitimate concern. If you look at flooding in one location, a simplistic way to do it is put a big pipe in, and we don't look downstream. That's a huge mistake. Chris is a very experienced modeler. He uses computer models to simulate things, and when he recommends controls, he would show a bigger conveyance system up here and then be able to simulate that flow all the way downstream and see if it changes any of the flood extents. So he shows some really cool stuff. He's really good at this. So you got to be careful. You can't do that. You need to track that flow through the system and make sure that it's truly not just moving a problem. One interesting thing you said about having water come up and up to the surface. A normal stream generally flows bank full in about a 2-year event. And then what happens? It comes out of the banks, and then what do you have? The floodplain, right? That's what nature intended. There's a conveyance system. It generally is, by nature's way of flows and velocities and scour, it generally can convey about a 2-year event. Then it comes up to the surface and then spreads out. That's what your 100-year floodplain is doing. I mean, there's, I don't know this yet, but I haven't looked at historical. There's probably a stream there at one point. Now, with conveyance or whatever, the 100-year floodplain is what it is, but that functioned the way you would expect a conveyance system to function with a large rain event. It comes out of the conveyance system, spreads out on the land, and unfortunately, if there's structures in the land, those structures get flooded. So having conveyance systems that, particularly natural conveyance systems, where we do leave a functioning floodplain is like fundamental to stormwater management. Now, it's very difficult in urbanized areas, but that's kind of like a perfect scenario. The green infrastructure, I'm very impressed with everyone's knowledge of green infrastructure. It's great. It probably has a role. Rain barrels, no one's mentioned rain barrels. Rain barrels can help. But again,
Bob has a good program.
typically it's intended for the smaller events. But as you know, what I've always said, because my basement used to flood, which is ironic, right? As a stormwater engineer, I buy a house in a low-lying area that floods. But then I spent 2 years. No, this was like 10 years ago. So, you know, rain barrels on my property help a little bit, and my attitude is I'd rather 50 gallons in that rain barrel than 50 gallons in my basement. So again, every drop helps, but at some point we're going to be faced with, we have limited funds. What's the best return on our investment for the limited funds that we want to commit to this particular effort? And that's where, you know, there'll be good community discussion on it. What else did I miss? The mayor raised, what's that? Retrofits. Oh, retrofits. Retrofits are an extremely cost-effective thing to do. And that's probably a discussion for another night. But if you think about, and we have a map showing all the detention basins in Morgantown, most of those were probably designed to control about a 10-year event. So everything below a 10-year event typically rips through. Go out and look at those if you have surface ones during a typical rain event and see if there's water in them. I suspect there's no water in them. They have an outlet pipe that's probably 12, 18-inch pipe. They're designed for like just a peak matching of a 10 and 25-year event. With some pretty quick analysis, you can go and you can do a lot of things to those basins to squeeze more benefit out of them. It's already a dedicated stormwater management facility. Make it work better. Sometimes it might be taking a little more land, grading. Other times it's just changing the outlet control structure. And again, that's right in Chris's wheelhouse. What else?
Individual homeowner systems, what are the requirements for individual homeowners to put in some sort of smaller sites?
We'll look at it. Again, it's a tool, and we want this toolbox to be, you know, as broad as possible so that we can explore a lot of options.
Do people really use their roadways?
So, this is an interesting concept, and I've seen it mostly done in combined systems, okay, where you have a typical catch basin on the street. That catch basin typically has a 12-inch pipe to the main line in the road, okay? So that means it's much generally up to probably a 10 or 25-year event. The water's entering the catch basin, blowing into the pipe, and then that pipe is easily exceeded capacity during big events. Some communities have throttled that 12-inch pipe so that the catch basin fills up with water, the gutter line of the road stores water. They'll try to leave, if the road has a good crown, they'll turn a two-way side street into sort of, during larger rain events, really a center line turn lane, because your gutter lines are full of water, and you literally can store water in the streets. Now, you got to
Big crown on the road, is that
the road has to have a crown, and the road can't have steep topography. Topography is going to be another challenge with you guys. But some communities have utilized these devices to basically throttle a connection to the main storm line to try to get some storage in an inlet and then use the gutter line of the road for storage. Got to be careful with it, but it has been done.
I have a question about the next phase of the project. Could you put up the diagram that you have, the areas that you've identified? Yeah, those numbers. Now, in this particular case, these are the flooding clusters.
Yes.
In the next phase, you would be examining these flooding clusters, correct? Would you be engaged in a benefit cost analysis of what some high-level activities could be associated with each of those clusters, and then identify the ones which would have the highest benefit cost analysis for additional remediation or replacement?
Yeah, so that was a good question, and that is true. On the next phase, that's where we would really get into. The first phase was just honestly kind of a high-level understanding of what are we dealing with here, where did the flooding occur. In the next phase, we would start to identify specific improvement projects or alternatives to try to alleviate the flooding, including cost estimates for some of those projects. This was honestly kind of our first attempt at putting some boundaries around these clusters. There are other locations outside of these clusters that they may not have been quite as concentrated, but could have been just as worse or kind of mini clusters, so to speak. So there are some additional discussions that still probably need to be had in terms of, are there other locations throughout the service area that may warrant some additional focus as well beyond this kind of first list of clusters themselves. But that's where we would get in kind of to the detailed modeling that John was talking about earlier, where we could really show, you know, if you look at alternative one, which is this improvement project, how much would the flooding be reduced as a result of implementing that project, where we would show that with some of the two-dimensional stormwater modeling work that we do.
Will you each capture information about those individuals or organizations that are currently paying for FEMA insurance? Is that publicly available so you can use that as part of the benefit cost analysis?
Want that?
I'm not sure if that's publicly available, who's paying insurance and who doesn't, because it really kind of depends on their lender. But the benefit cost analysis is still a viable option that we do when we talk about structure flooding and recurrence of structure flooding, repeat flooding. So even without that information, when we start simulating various control alternatives and running the models, we'll say this many structures flood under this, the cost of that alternative is that. And basically you begin to start trying to hone in on where your greatest return on investment is. And this formula is, as you know, I think, for the recurring flooding and how to estimate that damage.
Hi. Like Jenny said, I'm the 7th Ward City Councilor. I believe I'm in 11 up there. My house got flooded. But my first question, I have a bunch of questions. So was there WVU reporting included on this study in this map as far as their damages that they suffered? Was that included?
So I guess the documented flooding photos that we have in this PowerPoint were information that we received from MUB. Yeah, I mean, the university has kind of subsequently, since we started this process, provided us with their, what I would say is GIS mapping of their storm infrastructure, along with a few reports from like older reports that they did on just stormwater improvement alternatives that they were looking at in previous years.
Okay, thank you. When we talked about parking, have you seen parking plans that have like been tailored towards stormwater management, increasing better stormwater management? I've looked at our minimum parking requirement. I'm on the parking authority. I've looked at our minimum parking requirements. They're pretty old, antiquated, but would you know of communities that you could use as an example that kind of tailor their minimum parking requirements to stormwater management?
Not off the top of my head, but I will tell you this. US EPA has published a lot of material on what they call low-impact development. Mm-hmm. So, and it's been a while since I've looked at their website, but I believe they have a number of case studies there where they have shown model ordinances and policies that can be implemented to try to mitigate the impacts of stormwater. Okay. And if that doesn't work for you, we can talk more, and I can connect you with sources to that.
Yeah, I mean, it would just be interesting to see how other communities have done it, obviously, and there's, our parking code is kind of, there's a lot there.
Are there parking islands, other islands required, free islands required inside parking lots in the city?
I don't believe so.
That's one of the things a lot of communities have done to help mitigate.
Tree islands.
So it'll be, developers don't love it, but it definitely helps stop a lot of the runoff.
And the other thing, the little nuance of that is, it's depressed parking islands. It's not the elevated curbs. So you basically use these islands, you direct the runoff into these vegetated areas with gravel and an under drain. And it, oftentimes we've seen where, depending on the extent of those and the amount of drainage to them, you can see a fairly shallow profile of vegetation completely capture, 0.5, 0.7 inch rain event with zero discharge. Green roofs, something we can talk about someday, 'cause I'm very high on those green roofs, but it's not for everybody, I get it. But.
Great, all right, I appreciate it. You talked about how the system is complex. Is this a more complex system, in your opinion, than you see in communities of a similar size, or less complex, about the same?
Not necessarily. I would say it's pretty typical in these older communities to have this type of system. In other communities, maybe it is like one single pipe that's conveying both the stormwater and the sanitary, so it truly is what we would call a combined sewer. This isn't necessarily the case in a lot of these neighborhoods where there is already kind of a dedicated separate storm sewer and a dedicated separate sanitary sewer. The challenge becomes is really trying to understand and identify where are all of those cross connections between the storm and the sanitary, and all of the individual laterals and downspouts from every property within those communities that are going to be tying in at various locations, some of which may have sanitary connections into the storm sewer, unfortunately, or vice versa, storm sewer connections into the sanitary sewer. And it's just a big effort to really kind of identify all those locations and truly separate out stormwater and sanitary.
Yeah, definitely. Mine was actually one of those when MUB came and we fixed it.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, they told me what to do, and I fixed it. Anyway, we talk about MUB's completed some maintenance improvements. This is probably more a question for MUB, I guess. What maintenance improvements have been done so far, and do we have like records of that I could share with like my neighbors and stuff like that?
We keep all of our maintenance records of projects that we do, and we can, if there's certain questions of certain streets, we can provide that information of what was done on storm or sanitary.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, that'd be great. I'll ask the specific neighbors that I've communicated with if they have anything. I'll send it off to you, and we'll get there. We'll work together. We talked about some of the stuff you got from WVU. What kind of participation have we gotten from the DOH?
I will let MUB answer that in terms of partnership from DOH. They've been involved in a couple of the meetings that we participated in, just kind of bringing everyone together to discuss these issues. We did show the image there along Pattison where it's kind of a hodgepodge, so to speak, of ownership between DOH, the university, and MUB. I think everyone recognizes that they are an important partner in this process because some of their infrastructure could be undersized or contributing to the flooding as well. So I don't know how regularly MUB meets with DOH to talk about stormwater management issues, but the collaboration, I would say, is ongoing at this point to hopefully have them participate in the next phase of the flood control study.
All right, perfect. And then I feel like I remember you, so the next phase that we'd be looking at is a further direction of the study, right? Would that phase talk about more specific implementation steps other than a lot of the stuff we've talked about already?
Yes, I think what we would be talking about, because right now it's just kind of like a high-level discussion of should we consider green infrastructure, conveyance upsizing, or detention. Within each one of those cluster areas, we would drill down and identify specific projects to try to alleviate the flooding issue, whether that's sewer separation or upsizing or residential controls or regional stormwater controls, that's all part of the next phase, where the outcome of that would be a suite of alternatives, so to speak, with costs associated with each one of those and the benefits from a flood reduction standpoint.
Okay, so yeah, and I guess following into that, so when we talk about benefits, is that like, are you talking about like tangible data that we can see? I know you talked about models.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have like a 2D modeling image, but that is something that we have generated on previous projects where it will show in the existing conditions, whether it's a 25-year event or a 100-year event, here's how much flooding we would expect. Now, when we put the improvement project on top of that, how much has that flooding reduced, or has it been eliminated? And we can show that kind of with, we call it 2D modeling, basically kind of gives you a plan view of the extent and depth of floodwaters, both before and after a project is implemented.
Perfect. And then I guess the last thing from the city's perspective I would ask is has there been like studies done that kind of maybe would have a consultancy firm or somebody who has knowledge in these matters, like gone over city code, like building, zoning, planning, and things of that nature with an eye towards stormwater, and then give recommendations? Is that something you guys done in the past?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we have planned for that as being one of our scope items in the next phase to, just take kind of an overall stormwater perspective and review of the city's ordinances or MUB standards and regulations, such that we can come back with some tangible recommendations of changes to make in the code or the ordinances to help alleviate some of these issues. So that is part of our scope.
Great. All right. Thank you, guys.
Sure.
Will there be other meetings like this? Because we were thinking that maybe there would be more neighbors here, and I do see some neighbors here and appreciate it, but there are definitely people, if this were a different year when we had more flooding, you would hear, because we don't just have flooding in this area just at those 2 points, that's extreme, but there's regular flooding, as you can see, because people live in the floodplain. So it would be lovely if, as you go through your steps, if there were other opportunities.
Sure, absolutely. And we have, again, that's something else we have accounted for in our scope for the next phase, is a series of additional meetings such as this. John mentioned earlier the improvement alternatives, do have to be driven to some degree by the local community. So when we evaluate improvement alternatives and show the benefits and the results, we do want to solicit community feedback on all of those. So whether or not we've got individual meetings for all of the clusters is to be determined. Maybe we can group some of them together, but the intention would be we would have some more of these meetings to actually show the improvement alternatives and what the results are. Thank you for having us. You're welcome. Yep, thanks.
Took a break.
Well, that was pretty impressive. Thank you, guys, for that information. Wait for Michael to get back.
I think it might be worth mentioning that the MUB board, after we had these events last year, became very concerned about how anyone could go about addressing these issues. And as we discussed it, we realized this is not something that MUB is entirely responsible for, but it will take cooperation from the other parties, including the State Road Commission, Department of Public Highways, WVU, the city, and even the county when it comes to zoning or requirements for construction. So it's a long-term process, as you can see. The studies themselves are quite extensive, require time and a financial commitment. And so it's an exciting concept to deal with. Obviously, if we continue to grow and continue to have more construction, we have to be concerned about ways to mitigate water runoff. So we're proud of having initiated this. We really look forward to working with our partners in this endeavor, and it's going to be an exciting process to see what we can do in the future. So I just wanted to say we do try to think into the future and plan forward, and this is one of those situations that really availed itself. So it's been good. It's been a good initiative.
You okay, buddy?
Yep, good.
So nothing on the GM's report?
No, not tonight.
Okay. So we'll move to board member issues and discussions. Thank you, Barbara, for those comments. Would anybody else have any comments on the board? If not, I do. We'll take a few minutes to read some prepared comments. Probably a little bit of self-therapy, but so be it. I'm extremely proud to have been a MUB board member for 20-plus years and to be chairman of this board for over 10 years. I have been very fortunate to work with so many hardworking, diverse, intelligent, community-minded board members, as well as 3 general managers, Jim Green, Tim Ball, and Mike McNulty, and the MUB staff, past and present. What an excellent group of individuals, so talented and so dedicated to this organization. I have been very fortunate to see many of these staff members move on and watch MUB recruit highly qualified individuals to keep the MUB organization at a world-class level. What an experience I've had, what an education I've learned. I will always appreciate my Uncle Jim Preet for pushing me 20 years ago to get involved, to use my knowledge, my experience, my leadership skills to give back to the community where you live and your family lives. I'm also smart enough to know that I was a small part of this organization. But I do take great pride in my leadership role and the success stories. There have been many. The large expansions of the water treatment plant, the wastewater treatment plant, the Flegel Dam and Reservoir, so many infrastructure improvements over the years, just so many you can't even begin to mention them. All designed for, number one, the health and safety of our ratepayers, but also for the future growth of this community. MUB has not stood idle on my watch. We have always been aggressive in our commitment to the future and economic development of this community. And we have seen this growth recently with such items as Mountaintop Beverage, Westridge Development, Milan Park are prime examples of how MUB has improved this community. This is a prime example, this presentation tonight is a prime example of how MUB decided to not take lightly the flood issues this community experienced in 2021, but to look deeper into our storm system and evaluate potential solutions, never resting. However, with all this success and foresight It has been determined that my leadership and efforts are no longer valued by the Morgantown City Council. I will not be reappointed to this board. So with much regret and heartache, this will be my last official business as the chairman of the Morgantown Utility Board. I leave this organization in great hands with this present board and this staff. But more importantly, the individuals that make MUB work every day, the office personnel, the customer service, the engineers, the field staff, who's out there every day in this community making this system work. Thank you. So I think that is the motion to adjourn.
Before we adjourn, I'd just like to say the board certainly has appreciated the work and the dedication that you've put into this effort for many years, and we will sorely miss your leadership.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Okay.
To adjourn.
Move to
I
adjourn.
also echo Barbara's comments. I've learned a lot working with JT and the MUB staff. I think what is underappreciated is the fact that over all these 20-plus years of service that JT has, not only have we had major improvements to our wastewater, water, and stormwater systems, but we've been able to do it by having some of the lowest sewer, water, and wastewater rates in the state of West Virginia. And I think that's something that is to be commended.
Thank you, Tom.
Mr. Chairman, I know it's only been a little over a year that I've had the privilege to be on this board and work with you, and so I've not obviously had the breadth of experience that you have or gotten to see all of the contributions you've made, but I have in the last few months as we've been going through this process of working with the city, been able to see your leadership on this, and despite the fact that throughout this process, with you being the next person up for reappointment, that this was a specter that was looming. I think your work in these processes has been very laudable. When we had the subcommittee meeting last month, your leadership through that and your leadership on the Fleagle Dam and working with the city, working with the community to make sure that we had an agreement that worked not only for the city but for MUB, I think was very commendable, and I was very appreciative of the way you handled those situations. Thank you.
Thank you for the awards, Eric. Appreciate that.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, take just a moment. On behalf of MUB's 140-plus employees, I want to say thank you for your leadership. We want to thank you for the great things that you've done, not just on these projects and helping Morgantown and Monongalia County grow, but what you've done for the employees personally. Under your leadership, we've been able to have health care insurance for 100% of our employees that's affordable. In today's market of health care and what it costs, that is a remarkable feat. And the employees are very grateful, as I'm very grateful. You recruited me to Morgantown, and I appreciate that. It's been a wonderful 2 years for you to mentor me and help coach me in this new role, and I greatly appreciate it, and I know you will be missed.
Thank you, Mike.
I move we adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, so moved.